What vanishes a man without a trace off the rocky Maine coast? What waits in the deep, patient enough to stay hidden for 21 years? And why did powerful forces bury the truth beneath layers of lies? Subscribe now and hit the bell. The final revelation about what really happened that stormy night will leave you speechless. You don't want to miss what's waiting in the deep. The salt wind off the Atlantic tasted sharp and ancient, carrying the cries of gulls and the low, constant grumble of the ocean against the rocky Maine coastline. It was October 1975, and the small fishing village of Havens End was buttoning up for winter. Chimney smoke curled into the gray sky, and the brightly painted boats bobbed restlessly in the harbor, their owners busy mending nets or stacking lobster traps. Life here moved with the rhythm of the tides, predictable and slow, until Arthur Bellwether vanished. Arthur wasn't a man who stood out. 70 years old, his face was a map of wrinkles etched by decades of sea air and hard work. His eyes, a faded blue like washed denim, held a quiet kindness. A retired fisherman, he lived alone in a small, weather-beaten cottage perched precariously on the cliffs overlooking the restless sea. His routine was as fixed as the North Star. Every morning, rain or shine, he walked the winding cliff path down to the harbor. He'd buy his newspaper from old Mrs. Gable at the general store, exchange a few words about the weather, then sit on his favorite bench, watching the boats come and go, a thermos of weak tea steaming beside him. Evenings, he'd be back on the cliffs, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon as the sun bled into the water. His neighbor, Margaret Finch, a widow with sharp eyes and a sharper memory, noticed his absence first. Arthur hadn't collected his paper. His cottage door, usually open to catch the morning sun, remained stubbornly shut. By noon, worry gnawing at her, Margaret crossed the narrow strip of wild grass between their homes and knocked. Silence. She tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, the cottage was neat but cold. Arthur's breakfast dishes sat unwashed in the sink. His worn jacket hung on its usual peg. His reading glasses lay folded on the table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set, waiting for an actor who hadn't shown up. "Arthur," Margaret called out, her voice thin in the stillness. "Arthur, you in here?" Only the ticking of a mantel clock answered her. She checked the small bedroom, the bathroom. Nothing. A deep unease settled in her stomach, cold and heavy. Arthur Bellwether, a creature of absolute habit, was gone. She alerted the local sheriff, Ben Crocker. Ben was a solid man, born and raised in Havens End. He knew everyone, and he knew Arthur wasn't the type to wander off. He organized a search. Men from the village combed the treacherous cliffs, calling Arthur's name until their voices grew hoarse. Boats scanned the shoreline, their spotlights cutting beams through the gathering dusk. Search dogs sniffed along the paths, whining and circling near the cliff edge closest to Arthur's cottage, but finding no clear trail down. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed him whole. Ben interviewed everyone. Mrs. Gable confirmed Arthur never picked up his paper. Pete Henderson, who ran the bait shop, hadn't seen him. Nobody had seen Arthur Bellwether after he returned home the evening before his disappearance. There were no signs of a struggle at the cottage. No forced entry. No angry words overheard. No money missing from a small tin box under his bed. Arthur lived simply, owed no one, had no known enemies. He was just gone. The only faint whisper of something unusual came from young Timmy Dawes. Timmy delivered papers before dawn. He swore that on the morning Arthur vanished, just as the first gray light touched the horizon, he saw a strange light out at sea. Not a boat light, he insisted, but a single, bright, unwavering point, like a star fallen onto the water, hovering maybe a mile offshore, directly opposite Arthur's cottage. It was their one moment, and when he looked back after stuffing a paper into a mailbox, it was gone. Timmy was known for his wild imagination, and the adults mostly dismissed it. A trick of the light, they said, a reflection, wishful thinking. But Margaret remembered Arthur talking differently in the weeks before he vanished. He'd seemed distracted, less interested in the harbor gossip, more drawn to the vast emptiness of the ocean. Once, when she'd commented on the rough seas, he'd murmured something strange, his eyes distant. "It's not just the water that moves out there, Maggie," he'd said, his voice low. "There's things beneath, things that watch. Sometimes they come up." She'd laughed it off then. "Arthur Bellwether, you've been reading too many of those silly magazines." Sea monsters, indeed. He hadn't laughed with her. He just looked at her, that faded blue gaze suddenly sharp and unsettling. "Not monsters, Maggie. Things older, smarter, things we forgot how to see." Now, standing in his cold, empty cottage, those words echoed in her mind, chilling her more than the October air. Had Arthur seen something? Had something seen him? The official search wound down after a week. No body washed ashore. No clues emerged. Sheriff Crocker filed a missing persons report, the paperwork feeling hopelessly inadequate. The state police took a cursory look, but with no evidence of foul play and an elderly man living alone near dangerous cliffs, the conclusion was tragically simple. Presumed accidental death. Fallen into the sea. The case grew cold, layered under the dust of passing seasons in the Havens and Sheriff's Office. Arthur Bellwether became a sad local story, a cautionary tale whispered to children about staying away from the cliff edge, especially in bad weather. Except Margaret Finch never forgot the look in Arthur's eyes that last time. She never forgot his strange words. And she never forgot Timmy Dawes' story about the strange light. Years turned into decades. The village changed. Mrs. Gable passed. Pete Henderson sold the bait shop. Sheriff Crocker retired. New faces arrived, unaware of the quiet man who once watched the sea. Margaret grew old herself, her steps slower, but her mind remained clear. Every October, as the wind turned cold and the sea grew restless, she would walk to the cliff edge near Arthur's now derelict cottage, gazing out at the endless gray water, wondering. 21 years passed. The world moved on. Then, in the damp spring of 1996, a discovery was made not in the churning Atlantic, but in the quiet, ordered depths of a government archive hundreds of miles away. A discovery that would rip the thin veil of forgetfulness from Arthur Bellwether's disappearance and send shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Haven's End. It began with a single, seemingly mundane document, a weather report for October 15th, 1975. The day Arthur vanished. The report, filed by a junior Coast Guard officer based on radar and visual observations, contained a single line that defied belief. It stated, with bureaucratic certainty, that the sea state off Haven's End that night was recorded as calm, glassy, zero significant swell. Asterisk, asterisk, there was no storm. No raging seas to sweep an old man from the cliffs. The ocean, the report claimed, had been as still as a pond. But everyone in Haven's End remembered the howling wind, the crashing waves, the night the sea seemed angry enough to swallow the world. And Arthur Bellwether. Hashtag part 2. The revelation of the impossible weather report landed like a depth charge in the quiet waters of Haven's End. Sheriff Crocker, now gray-haired and running the hardware store, read the article in the Portland Press-Herald with hands that trembled slightly. He remembered that night vividly. The wind screaming around his patrol car, rain lashing the windshield, the sheer physical effort needed just to walk along the cliff path during the search. Glassy seas? It was unthinkable. Margaret Finch, frail but fiercely alert, saw the report reprinted in the local weekly. The paper shook in her grasp. Zero significant swell, she whispered to her empty living room. The memory of that night's fury was etched into her bones. That's a lie. A terrible impossibilité. A cold certainty settled over her, colder than the ocean's deepest trench. Autor hot and fun. Something else had happened. The story, dormant for 2 decades, suddenly had fresh oxygen. A reporter from Bangor, sensing the bizarre contradiction, arrived in Haven's End. He tracked down the now-grown Timmy Dawes, who ran a charter fishing boat. Timmy, his face weathered like old driftwood, confirmed his boyhood sighting with startling clarity. "Yeah, the light," he said, leaning against the railing of his boat, the sea nymph. Bright, steady, like nothing I ever seen on a boat before or since. Hovering, then gone. Poof. And that wind, it was screaming like a banshee, waves crashing high as houses on them cliffs. But that report says calm. He shook his head, a deep frown creasing his brow. Something ain't right. Something was real wrong that night. The reporter found Margaret, her eyes burning with a long-held fire. She spoke of Arthur's final, unsettling words. Things beneath things that watch. She described his distracted state, his sudden, intense focus on the deep ocean in those last weeks. He wasn't afraid of the sea, she insisted, her voice thin but strong. He respected it, like an old friend. But something new was out there. Something that scared him. The story gained traction. Vanished fisherman, government cover-up, the headlines blared. The impossible weather report became the focal point. How could trained Coast Guard observers, using radar and visual confirmation, get it so catastrophically wrong? Was it a simple, colossal error buried in bureaucracy? Or was it deliberate? If deliberate, why? What about Arthur Bellwether warranted falsifying a weather report? State Police Detective Sarah Vance, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a reputation for meticulous work, was assigned to re-examine the cold case. The weather report anomaly demanded it. Her first stop was the National Archives branch where the report surfaced. It was part of a routine declassification batch of mundane Coast Guard logs. The archivist, a nervous young man, could offer no explanation. "It's just a sheet of paper in a box, detective," he stammered. No notes, no flags. Came in with thousands like it. Vance tracked down the junior officer who filed the original report, a man named Paul Davison, retired and living in Florida. Over a crackling phone line, Davison sounded bewildered. Haven's End? 1975? Honestly, detective, I barely remember. We process dozens of reports every shift. But calm seas? On the Maine coast in October? That would be unusual. Highly unusual. He paused. The logs were filled in based on the watch officer's notes from the radar room and the observation deck. I just typed what was given to me. The watch officer from that shift was long dead. The trail within the Coast Guard seemed to evaporate. Vance turned her attention back to Haven's End. She requested the original 1975 case file from the county sheriff's office. It was disappointingly thin. Crocker's initial report, statements from Margaret, Mrs. Gable, Pete Henderson, and Timmy Dawes, a hand-drawn map of the search area, and the official conclusion, accidental death by drowning, presumed. No physical evidence. Nothing. Frustrated, Vance decided to revisit the only physical location involved, Arthur Bellwether's cottage. Decades of neglect had taken their toll. The roof sagged, windows were broken, and the salty air had warped the wood. Inside, dust lay thick, and the smell of damp and decay was overpowering. It felt like a tomb. Vance moved carefully, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She checked the floorboards Crocker had inspected years before. Solid. The fireplace was cold and empty. She poked through the meager belongings left behind. Some worn clothes, old fishing manuals, a few yellowed photographs of people long gone. Nothing screamed clue. She was about to leave when her light caught something wedged behind the heavy, old-fashioned cast-iron radiator near the window, facing the sea. It was a small, water-stained notebook, its cheap cardboard cover warped. Heart pounding slightly, Vance carefully pried it loose. The pages were brittle, covered in faded, spidery handwriting. Arthur Bellwether's journal. Most entries were mundane. Weather notes, fish prices, chores done. But the final entries, dated in the weeks before his disappearance, were different. The handwriting grew more agitated, the sentences fragmented. October 1st, saw it again last night. Clear as day, not a boat. Too steady, too quiet. Deep water glow, like phosphorus but colder, brighter. Moves against the current. Asterisk. October 5th, told Maggie. She thinks I'm cracked. Maybe I am, but it watches, from the deep. Feels it, like eyes on your back, underwater, asterisk. October 10th, heard them. Not on the radio. In the water. Through the hull. when I put my ear to the piling. Whispers, not words. Sounds, deep sounds, like whale song but wrong. So wrong. Makes your teeth ache. Asterisk. October 14th. They know I see. They know I hear. The light is closer tonight. Brighter. Shining right on the cottage. What do they want? Why me? Asterisk. The last entry, dated October 14th, the night before he vanished, was a single, chilling line, scrawled so hard the pencil had nearly torn the paper. They're coming. Asterisk. Detective Vance stood in the decaying cottage, the journal cold in her gloved hand. The impossible weather report. The strange light witnessed by a boy. The ravings of an old man about lights and the deep, unnatural sounds and being watched. And now this. It pointed away from accident, away from simple crime. It pointed towards something profoundly unsettling, something that lived not just in the realm of missing persons, but in the shadowy depths of the unexplained. The case was no longer just cold. It was plunged into a deep, freezing darkness. And the question wasn't just who or why anymore. It was what? What had been out there on the impossibly stormy, officially calm sea? What had taken Arthur Bellwether? And what? Detective Vance wondered with a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Had the Coast Guard or someone else been trying to hide? Hashtag part 3. The journal entries were a seismic shift. Detective Vance sat in her car outside Arthur Bellwether's decaying cottage, the worn notebook open on the passenger seat. The fading light of the Maine afternoon did little to dispel the deep chill the words had instilled. They're coming. The phrase echoed, stark and terrifying. This wasn't dementia. The earlier entries were lucid, observational. This was terror, documented terror. She needed experts. Vance drove back to Augusta, the state capital, the journal carefully sealed in an evidence bag beside her. Her first stop was a marine biologist at the University of Maine, Dr. Thorne, known for his work on deep-sea bioluminescence and cetacean communication. She showed him the transcribed entries about the light and the sounds. Thorne, a man with kind eyes behind thick glasses, listened intently, his initial skepticism fading as Vance relayed the details. A steady, bright light deep offshore? Not impossible, he conceded. We document incredible light displays from unknown organisms kilometers down. But colder light? That's subjective. The sounds. Whale song but wrong? That's more intriguing. Cetacean vocalizations are complex, but wrong implies something unfamiliar, perhaps artificial modulation. And hearing it transmitted through a wooden piling? Sound travels efficiently through water and solid structures, but the description, he tapped his fingers thoughtfully. It suggests an intensity, a penetration, unusual for natural sources. It could be geological, seabed shifts, methane vents. But paired with the light observation and the psychological impact Arthur describes, it's unsettling. It doesn't fit any known natural pattern neatly. Unsettling. The words seemed inadequate. Vance's next visit was to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a retired astrophysicist consulted occasionally by law enforcement on unusual light phenomena. Reed, sharp and pragmatic, examined the descriptions of the light. Unwavering, star-like, hovering, disappearing abruptly. Not an aircraft, she stated flatly. Not in 1975. Not hovering silently over the ocean for extended periods. Not a meteor. Ball lightning? Possible, but exceptionally rare over water and typically chaotic, not steady. A secret military test? She shrugged. Possible. The Cold War was full of strange projects. But falsifying a weather report to cover a test seems extreme, even for that era. And why target an old fisherman? She leaned forward. The most troubling aspect is the contradiction. Multiple witnesses recall a violent storm. The official record states calm seas. One of those realities is false. If the witnesses are correct and the record is fabricated, then the light, the sounds, Arthur's disappearance, they were significant enough for someone to actively hide the environmental conditions surrounding them. Significant enough to lie. To create a false reality on paper. Vance felt the case spiraling into something far bigger than a missing persons file. She contacted the Coast Guard again, demanding access to the original 1975 radar logs and observation notes for the sector off Havens Inn for October 14th and 15th. The request was met with bureaucratic delays and vague references to archival disarray. It took a call from a state attorney general's office to cut through the red tape. The logs, when they finally arrived, were a shock. The radar returns for the night in question showed nothing unusual. No unidentified contacts. No anomalies. Just the expected blips of commercial shipping far out to sea. The observation deck log, signed by the deceased watch officer, contained brief, bland entries. Asterisk 2000 HRS. Partly cloudy. Visibility moderate. Sea state 2, slight. That asterisk 2200 HRS. Overcast. Visibility reduced. Sea state 2. Asterisk 0000 HRS. Fog banks offshore. Sea state 2. Asterisk it perfectly matched the calm weather report. Yet, Vance held the conflicting memories of an entire village, the visceral recollection of a storm. She held Arthur Bellwether's terrified journal, and she held the testimony of Timmy Dawes about a bright, hovering light. The official records were pristine, logical, and utterly contradicted by lived experience. Someone had sanitized the night. Driven by a mix of professional duty and a gnawing personal unease, Vance returned to Haven's End. She needed to see the place Arthur described, the place where he felt watched. She walked down the overgrown path to the base of the cliffs near his cottage, a dangerous scramble even in daylight. The tide was out, revealing a narrow, rocky beach littered with seaweed and driftwood. The cliff face rose sheer and imposing, dark rock streaked with bird droppings. Waves, gentle, today lapped rhythmically. Then she saw it, near the waterline, partially obscured by a large, barnacle-encrusted boulder. Something gleamed dully. Not rock, not seaweed, metal. Vance carefully picked her way across the slippery rocks. It was a small, rectangular plate, about the size of her palm, made of a dark, non-corrosive metal she couldn't immediately identify. It was slightly curved, as if it had been part of a larger, cylindrical structure. One side was smooth. The other bore markings. Not letters, but intricate, geometric patterns etched with incredible precision. They looked alien, utterly unlike any manufacturing code, serial number, or nautical symbol she had ever seen. The patterns seemed to flow, interlocking curves and sharp angles that gave the unsettling impression of circuitry, or perhaps writing. Along one edge, fused into the metal itself, was a tiny, dark disk, like a flattened bead of obsidian. Vance's breath caught. This wasn't driftwood. This wasn't The revelation of the impossible weather report landed like a depth charge in the quiet waters of Haven's End. Sheriff Crocker, now gray-haired and running the hardware store, read the article in the Portland Press-Herald with hands that trembled slightly. He remembered that night vividly. The wind screaming around his patrol car, rain lashing the windshield, the sheer physical effort needed just to walk along the cliff path during the search. Glassy seas? It was unthinkable. He could still feel the sting of salt spray, the way the gale had threatened to rip the flashlight from his grip. That report was a lie, painted over the raw truth of the storm like cheap whitewash. Margaret Finch, frail but fiercely alert, saw the report reprinted in the local weekly. The paper shook in her grasp. Zero significant swell, she whispered to her empty living room, the familiar ticking of her own mantel clock suddenly loud and accusing. The memory of that night's fury was etched into her bones, the frantic hammering of rain on her roof, the howl that sounded almost alive. That's a lie. A terrible, impossible lie. A cold certainty settled over her, colder than the ocean's deepest trench. Arthur hadn't slipped. Something else had happened in that manufactured calm. The story, dormant for 2 decades, suddenly had fresh oxygen. A reporter from Bangor, sensing the bizarre contradiction, arrived in Haven's End. He tracked down the now-grown Timmy Dawes, who ran a successful charter fishing boat, the Sea Nymph. Timmy, his face weathered like old driftwood, confirmed his boyhood sighting with startling clarity, leaning against the boat's salt-crusted railing. "Yeah, the light," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if seeing it again. "Bright. Steady. Like nothing I ever seen on a boat before or since. Hovering. Not bobbing with the waves, just hanging there. Then gone. Poof. Like someone blew out a candle." And that wind, he shook his head, a deep frown creasing his brow. It was screaming like a banshee, waves crashing high as houses on them cliffs. "Water coming over the harbor wall, I heard. But that report says calm." He spat thoughtfully over the side. Something ain't right. Something was real wrong that night. Felt in my gut then, feel it now. The reporter found Margaret, her eyes burning with a long-held fire. She spoke of Arthur's final, unsettling words. Things beneath, things that watch. She described his distracted state, his sudden, intense focus on the deep ocean in those last weeks, spending hours on the cliffs, even in worsening weather. He wasn't afraid of the sea, she insisted, her voice thin but strong. He respected it, like an old friend. Knew its moods, its dangers. But something new was out there. Something that scared him deep. Saw it in his eyes. The story gained traction beyond the local paper. Vanished fisherman. Government cover-up? The regional headlines blared. The impossible weather report became the focal point, the spark igniting dormant suspicion. How could trained Coast Guard observers, using radar and visual confirmation, get it so catastrophically wrong? Was it a simple, colossal error buried in a labyrinth of bureaucracy? Or was it deliberate? If deliberate, why? What about the disappearance of a quiet, elderly fisherman in a remote coastal village warranted falsifying an official weather record? The anomaly was too glaring to ignore. State Police Detective Sarah Vance, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with a reputation for meticulous, unsentimental work, was assigned to re-examine the cold case. The weather report contradiction demanded it. Her first stop was the National Archives branch where the report had surfaced. It was part of a routine declassification batch of mundane Coast Guard logs. The young archivist, clearly flustered by the sudden attention, could offer no explanation. "It's just a sheet of paper in a box, detective," he stammered, pushing his glasses up his nose. "No notes, no flags. Came in with thousands like it from that period. We processed it, filed it. That's all." Vance tracked down the junior officer who filed the original report, a man named Paul Davison, retired and living in Florida. Over a crackling phone line, Davison sounded bewildered, his voice thin with age. "Haven's End? 1975? Honestly, detective, I barely remember the specifics. We processed dozens of reports every shift. It was routine. But calm seas? On the Maine coast in October." He paused, and Vance could almost hear the gears turning. That would be unusual, highly unusual, practically unheard of for that time of year. Another pause, longer this time. The logs. The logs were filled and based on the watch officer's notes from the radar room and the observation deck. I just typed what was given to me. That's the procedure. The watch officer from that shift, Vance learned, had died of a heart attack 10 years prior. The trail within the Coast Guard itself seemed to evaporate like sea mist. Vance turned her attention back to Haven's End. She requested the original 1975 case file from the county sheriff's office. It arrived, a thin manila folder smelling faintly of dust and old paper. Inside was disappointingly sparse. Sheriff Crocker's initial report, brief statements from Margaret Finch, Mrs. Gable, now deceased, Pete Henderson, who'd moved away, and young Timmy Dawes. There was a hand-drawn map of the search area, its pencil lines faded, and the official conclusion typed neatly. Accidental death by drowning, presumed. No physical evidence collected. No fingerprints lifted. Nothing. It was a file documenting an absence. Frustration gnawed at Vance. She needed something tangible. She decided to revisit the only physical location involved, Arthur Bellwether's cottage. Decades of neglect had taken a brutal toll. The roof sagged ominously. Windows were shattered eyes staring blankly at the sea, and the salty air had warped the wood into grotesque shapes. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp rot and decay. Dust lay like gray snow over everything. It felt less like a house and more like a crypt. Vance moved carefully, her powerful flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom, illuminating swirling motes in the air. She checked the floorboards Sheriff Crocker had inspected years before. Salid, no hidden compartments. The small stone fireplace was cold and empty, holding only the ghosts of long-dead fires. She poked through the meager belongings left behind. Some worn flannel shirts smelling of mildew, old fishing manuals with water-swollen pages, a few yellowed photographs of stern-faced people long gone. Nothing screamed clue. Nothing hinted at a life violently interrupted. She was about to leave, the sense of wasted time heavy upon her, when her light beam swept across the heavy, old-fashioned cast-iron radiator near the window, facing the sea. Something caught the edge of the light, a sliver of darkness wedged tightly behind the radiator and the damp plaster wall. Not dirt, not a dead insect. Paper. Vance crouched, ignoring the gritty dust on her knees. Using the tip of her pen, she carefully pried it loose. It was a small, water-stained notebook, its cheap cardboard cover warped and stiff. The binding was broken, pages bulging. Heart pounding with a sudden, sharp hope, Vance carefully opened it. The pages were brittle, threatening to crumble, covered in faded, spidery handwriting she recognized from Arthur's grocery lists in the case file. Arthur Bellwether's private journal. Most entries were mundane, expected, weather notes, fish prices at the market, chores done, a complaint about his arthritis. The handwriting was steady, unhurried. But the final entries, dated in the weeks before his disappearance, were different. The handwriting grew more agitated, jagged, the sentences fragmented, words crowded together as if crammed onto the page in haste. October 1st, saw it again last night. Clear as day through the binoculars. Not a boat light. Too steady. Too quiet. No engine, sound carried on the wind. Deep water glow. Like phosphorus but colder. Brighter. Moves against the current. Swims? Floats? Don't know. Asterisk. October 5th, told Maggie. She thinks I'm cracked. Maybe I am. But watches. From the deep. Feels it. Stronger each night. Like eyes on your back underwater. Heavy. Cold. Asterisk. October 10th. Heard them. Not on the radio. In the water. Through the hull, when I put my ear to the old piling down at the dock. Whispers. Not words. Sounds. Deep sounds. Like whale song, but wrong. So wrong. Twisted. Makes your teeth ache. Bone deep. Fear. Asterisk. October 14th. They know I see. They know I hear. The light is closer tonight. Brighter. Shining right on a cottage window. Like a spotlight. What do they want? Why me? Just an old man watching the sea. Asterisk. The last entry, dated October 14th, the night before he vanished, was a single, chilling line, scrawled so hard the pencil had nearly torn through the fragile paper, the letters digging deep. They're coming. Asterisk. Detective Vance stood frozen in the decaying cottage, the journal cold and heavy in her gloved hand. The beam of her flashlight trembled slightly, casting long, dancing shadows on the ruined walls. The impossible weather report. The strange light witnessed by a boy dismissed as imaginative. The unsettling ramblings of an old man about lights in the deep, unnatural sounds, and being watched. And now this. A first-hand account of mounting terror, documented in his own hand. It pointed decisively away from accident, away from any simple human crime. It pointed towards something profoundly unsettling, something that lived not just in the realm of missing persons, but in the shadowy, unexplored depths of the unexplained. The case was no longer just cold. It had been plunged into a deep, freezing darkness. And the question burning in Vance's mind wasn't just who or why anymore. It was what. What had been out there on the impossibly stormy, officially calm sea? What had watched Arthur Bellwether? What had he heard whispering through the water? And what, Detective Vance wondered with a knot of dread tightening like a vice in her stomach, Had the Coast Guard, or someone far more powerful, been trying so desperately to hide? The cliff path outside seemed suddenly exposed, the vast, gray ocean beyond it no longer just water, but an immense, silent question mark. The journal entries were a seismic shift, cracking open the foundation of everything Detective Vance thought she knew. She sat in her unmarked sedan outside Arthur Bellwether's decaying cottage, the worn notebook open on the passenger seat, the brittle pages glowing faintly in the dashboard lights. The fading Maine afternoon had surrendered to dusk, painting the sky bruised purple and orange. But the words they're coming seemed to emit their own cold, phosphorescent dread. This wasn't the rambling of a confused mind. The earlier entries were lucid, observational, notes on weather, fish, daily aches. This was terror, documented, escalating terror. A man witnessing something profoundly wrong, feeling its attention fix upon him. She needed expertise. Vance drove back to Augusta through the gathering darkness, the journal carefully sealed in an evidence bag beside her, feeling less like paper and more like a vessel holding unspeakable fear. Her first stop was Dr. Eris Thorne at the University of Maine. Thorne, a marine biologist with kind eyes magnified behind thick glasses and a reputation for open-mindedness about the ocean's unknowns, listened intently in his cluttered office, shelves lined with jars of preserved specimens and models of deep-sea creatures. Vance showed him transcribed entries about the light and the sounds, omitting only the final, chilling line for now. Thorne's initial polite skepticism faded as Vance relayed the details. A steady, bright light deep offshore? Not impossible, he conceded, steepling his fingers. The abyss holds organisms capable of astonishing bioluminescent displays. Fireworks we've barely glimpsed. But colder light? That's subjective, but intriguing. It could imply a different wavelength, perhaps outside our normal visual comfort. He leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. The sounds. Whale song but wrong? That's more compelling. Cetacean vocalizations are incredibly complex, a true language of the deep. Wrong implies something unfamiliar, perhaps artificial modulation, or a structure fundamentally alien to known bioacoustics. And hearing it transmitted through a wooden piling. Thorne tapped his desk thoughtfully. Sound travels efficiently through water and solid structures. Yes, but the description makes your teeth ache, bone-deep fear, suggests an intensity, a low-frequency resonance, or harmonic distortion that could have profound physiological effects. It could be geological, seabed shifts, methane vent implosions. But paired with the light observation, the directional nature shining right on the cottage, and the psychological impact Arthur describes, it's unsettling. Deeply so. It doesn't fit any single known natural pattern neatly. It points towards an interaction, or perhaps an intelligence, manipulating phenomena we barely understand. Unsettling. Asterisk the word echoed in Vance's mind, feeling woefully inadequate. Her next visit was to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a retired astrophysicist occasionally consulted by law enforcement on unusual aerial phenomena. Reed, sharp, pragmatic, and possessing an air of weary skepticism, examined the descriptions of the light, unwavering, star-like, hovering, disappearing abruptly. Not an aircraft, she stated flatly, pacing her book-lined study. Not in 1975, not hovering silently over the ocean for extended periods. Meteor? Too slow, too controlled. Ball lightning? Possible, but exceptionally rare over water and typically chaotic, flickering, not steady. A secret military test. She shrugged, a gesture conveying decades of encountering such theories. Always possible. The Cold War was a playground for strange projects. But falsifying a weather report to cover a test? That's extreme operational security, even for that paranoid era. And why target an old fisherman? What threat could he pose? She stopped, turning her sharp gaze fully on Vance. The most troubling aspect, detective, remains the contradiction. Multiple credible witnesses recall a violent storm. The official, contemporaneous record states calm seas. One of these realities is demonstrably false. If the witnesses are correct and the record is fabricated, then the light, the sounds, Arthur's disappearance, they weren't just anomalies. They were significant enough, threatening enough for someone to actively hide the very environmental conditions surrounding them, to erase the storm, significant enough to lie, to create a false reality on paper. Vance felt the case spiraling out of the realm of local law enforcement into something vast and shadowy. She contacted the Coast Guard again, this time with the weight of the State Attorney General's office behind her request. Immediate access to the original 1975 radar logs and observation deck notes for the sector off havens in for October 14th and 15th. The response was swift, cloaked in bureaucratic efficiency that felt like deliberate obstruction. Requests were processing. Files were potentially misfiled during archival transfer. It took another 3 days of escalating pressure before a plain manila envelope arrived by secure courier. The logs were a different kind of shock. The radar returns for the night in question showed nothing. No unidentified contacts. No anomalous blips. No sudden appearances or disappearances. Just the expected, faint signatures of distant commercial shipping traffic far out in the designated lanes. The observation deck log, a lined ledger filled in by hand, contained brief, clinical entries signed by the deceased watch officer. 2,000 hours, partly cloudy, visibility moderate. Sea state 2, slight. Wind SW 5 to 10 knots, asterisk. 2,200 hours, overcast, visibility reduced to 2 miles. Sea state 2. Wind SW 10 to 15 knots, asterisk. 0000 HRS. Fog banks offshore, visibility less than 1 mile. Sea state 2. Wind SW 15 knots, gusting. Asterisk. It perfectly matched the calm weather report. A seamless, professional record of an utterly ordinary, slightly foggy autumn night. Yet, Vance held the visceral, collective memory of an entire village, the howling wind, the crashing waves, the palpable fear during the search. She held Arthur Bellwether's terrified journal entries, describing a light shining on his cottage and whispers through the water. She held Timmy Dawes's clear recollection of a hovering light vanishing abruptly. The official records were pristine, logical, and utterly, chillingly contradicted by lived experience and a dying man's documented terror. Someone hadn't just made a mistake. Someone had meticulously sanitized the night. Driven by a potent mix of professional duty and a gnawing personal unease that kept her awake, Vance returned to Havens into dawn. She needed to stand where Arthur stood. She needed to see the place he described, feeling watched, the place where the light found him. She carefully navigated the overgrown, crumbling path down the cliff face near his cottage, a treacherous descent even in the weak morning light. The tide was out, revealing a narrow, rocky beach strewn with slick seaweed, bleached driftwood, and rusting debris. The sheer cliff face rose above her, dark and imposing, streaked white with generations of bird droppings. The ocean, subdued now, lapped rhythmically against the stones. Then, near the waterline, half buried in gritty sand and partially obscured by a large, barnacle-encrusted boulder, something caught the low angle of the rising sun. A dull gleam, not the wet black of basalt, not the gray of granite. Metallic. Vance's breath hitched. She carefully picked her way across the slippery, uneven rocks, the cold sea spray dampening her pants. Kneeling, she brushed away the clinging sand and strands of kelp. It was a fragment, roughly the size of her palm, rectangular but slightly curved, as if it had once been part of a larger, cylindrical structure. The metal was dark, almost gunmetal gray, but with a faint, deep blue undertone. It felt unnaturally cold to the touch, even through her gloves, and surprisingly lightweight yet dense. One side was smooth, almost polished. The other side bore markings, not stamped letters or numbers, but intricate, geometric patterns etched or perhaps grown into the surface with impossible precision. They were unlike anything she'd ever seen. Interlocking curves, sharp, crystalline angles, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift subtly as she moved it in the light. It looked less like decoration and more like circuitry or an alien script. Along one slightly beveled edge, fused seamlessly into the metal itself, was a tiny, perfectly smooth disc, blacker than obsidian, drinking in the light. Vance's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't fishing gear. This wasn't wreckage from a known vessel. This wasn't natural. It felt other, ancient and advanced simultaneously, utterly foreign. It looked exactly like something that might have fallen from the hovering light Arthur described, shed during its descent or ascent through the chaotic energy of the storm that officially never was. She carefully photographed it in situ, then bagged it, her hands trembling only slightly. This wasn't just a clue. This was evidence. Tangible, physical evidence that something extraordinary, something beyond comprehension, had occurred on that cliff and in that impossibly stormy, officially calm sea. Back at the State Police Forensic Lab, the analysis began under strict secrecy. The results were baffling. The metal was an unknown alloy, incredibly lightweight yet harder than titanium, exhibiting near-perfect resistance to corrosion and extreme temperature fluctuations. The lab chief, a man who'd seen decades of evidence, was visibly unsettled. Composition doesn't match anything in our databases, detective. Not military aerospace alloys, not commercial marine grades, nothing. It's unique. The crystalline structure is unlike any known metallic bonding. It's as if it was forged under conditions we can't replicate, or assembled atom by atom. The geometric markings defied standard scanning. High-resolution imaging revealed layers of complexity that seemed almost fractal, patterns within patterns that made the analyst's eyes water. The tiny black disk? Initial spectroscopy suggested it was pure carbon, but structured in a hyper-dense, ordered lattice the lab's equipment couldn't fully resolve. It wasn't diamond. It wasn't graphite. It was something else. Something impossibly dense and strange, humming with a faint, subsonic resonance detectable only by the most sensitive instruments. The implications slammed into Vance with physical force. The object wasn't from Earth. Or, if it was from a technology so advanced it rendered humanity's achievements primitive. It linked Arthur's disappearance, the strange light, the impossible weather report, the sanitized radar logs, and the old fisherman's terrified journal into a single, terrifyingly coherent narrative. Someone somewhere, high in the chain of command, knew exactly what had happened. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, fabricating records, dismissing credible witnesses, burying the truth under layers of bureaucratic indifference and the presumption of a tragic accident. And Arthur Bellwether? He hadn't slipped. He hadn't wandered away. He hadn't been the victim of a mundane crime. He had been taken. Taken by something that descended from a light in the heart of a storm that officially never happened, leaving behind only a journal screaming silent terror and a piece of impossible technology on a lonely beach. The story detonated. Fishermen abducted by UFO. Government cover-up confirmed by alien artifact. The fragment, quickly dubbed the Haven's End artifact by a breathless media, became an instant global sensation. Conspiracy theorists descended on the tiny village like locusts. Satellite news trucks clogged the narrow harbor road, their bright lights turning night into day. Tourists and curiosity seekers arrived by the busload. Margaret Finch, besieged on her porch by reporters shouting questions about Arthur and the Watchers, became an unlikely, frail oracle of the unexplained. Detective Vance found herself thrust from the quiet pursuit of cold cases into the blinding, chaotic center of a storm far more intense than the one Arthur described. She had evidence of the extraordinary, tangible, lab-tested proof, but she still didn't have Arthur. She didn't know who had orchestrated the cover-up or precisely why. The artifact was a key, heavy and cold, but the lock it opened led into a labyrinth of state secrets, institutional lies, and a chilling new reality. The ocean hadn't given up Arthur Bellwether. It had given up something else. something that changed everything. The nation wasn't just stunned. It was gripped by a profound, collective unease, staring out at the vast, dark expanse of water and realizing, with a shiver, that the depths held more than secrets. They held capabilities. And on a stormy night in 1975, they had reached up and taken a man, leaving behind a piece of their impossible truth. The artifact sat in its high-security evidence locker, inert yet radiating silent, alien potential, waiting for the final, shocking revelation of who knew and what they had tried so desperately to hide. The discovery of the artifact detonated a global frenzy. Haven's End, once a sleepy haven for lobstermen and seabirds, became a chaotic circus. Satellite trucks sprouted like metallic mushrooms around the harbor, their cables snaking across the weathered planks of the docks. Strangers with intense eyes and expensive cameras combed the cliffs, peering into crevices, scanning the beach with metal detectors, desperate for another scrap of the impossible. News crews from continents away jostled for position on the narrow Main Street, their bright lights harsh against the gray shingles and salt-bleached wood. Margaret Finch's small, tidy cottage was perpetually besieged. Microphones thrust towards her like weapons as reporters shouted questions about Arthur, about the Watchers, about the light. Her frail figure, wrapped in a shawl, became an icon of bewildered testimony, her quiet words about Arthur's fear amplified into a global echo chamber. Detective Sarah Vance found herself ripped from the methodical world of cold cases and thrust onto a blinding, disorienting stage. Briefings escalated, first with state officials, their faces tight with concern, then with grim-faced federal agents whose questions were sharp and probing, their eyes revealing nothing. Her small-town missing persons case had metastasized into something labeled behind closed doors, a matter of potential non-terrestrial contact and strategic national security. The artifact itself vanished from a state lab, whisked away to a high-security Department of Defense facility buried deep within an anonymous mountain. Reports trickled back to Vance through official channels, heavily redacted, dripping with sterile scientific jargon that couldn't mask the underlying astonishment. The alloy remained unidentified, its properties defying every known law of metallurgy. The geometric patterns weren't decorative. Sophisticated analysis suggested they formed a multi-layered data storage system, but the encoding language was utterly alien, reacting subtly to specific high-frequency energy pulses but yielding no decipherable information. The tiny black disk was the ultimate enigma. Scans revealed an atomic structure of impossible density, hinting at technology manipulating matter on a subatomic scale. It wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary, potentially paradigm-shattering. And it was cold, silent, inert. Yet, its mere existence screamed of origins far beyond human understanding. Pressure mounted on Vance like the weight of the deep ocean itself. The public, the media, even her own superiors demanded answers she didn't possess. Where was Arthur Bellwether? Had he been abducted? Was he dead? His body lost to the abyss or elsewhere? Was this terrifying fragment all that remained of him? The artifact was proof of something, but it offered no closure, only deeper, darker questions. Then, a lifeline came from the depths of silence. An encrypted message, routed through layers of anonymizing protocols, appeared on a secure terminal Vance used for high-profile cases. Not on her phone, not in her email, directly onto a machine designed to be untouchable. It contained only a single name, Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance, Rhett, her grandfather, a man who had served in naval intelligence during the darkest days of the Cold War, a man whose eyes had held unspoken stories, who had passed away 5 years earlier, taking his secrets with him. Below the name were GPS coordinates and a date, 3 days from now. Midnight, a desolate, rocky stretch of coastline 50 miles south of Haven's End, accessible only by a treacherous dirt track. The name was a key, turning in a hidden lock. With a sense of stepping off the edge of the known world, Vance went alone. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the vast expanse of stars like shattered ice above. The only sound was the Atlantic's eternal rhythm, the sigh of waves gathering, the crash against unseen rocks, the hiss of retreat. The air tasted of salt and isolation. At the precise coordinates, a solitary figure materialized from the deeper shadows cast by towering dunes, silhouetted against the moonlit foam of the breaking surf. An old man, stooped but radiating a wiry alertness, clad in a worn pea coat that might have been Navy issued decades ago. Detective Vance? His voice was gravel scraped over stone, weathered by time and salt air. Vance kept her hand near her holstered service weapon, the weight familiar but offering little comfort here. "Who are you?" "Call me Finn," he said, stepping closer. Moonlight revealed a face deeply carved by time and experience, eyes that held the flat, assessing look of a predator or a lifelong spy. "I served with your grandfather. Elias was a good man, knew the value of silence, knew when a secret could burn a hole right through you." He paused, his gaze sweeping the dark, restless water. He knew about Haven's End, about Bellwether, knew they tried to bury it deeper than the Mariana Trench, knew they'd lie until the lie became the truth. "They? Who?" Vance demanded, the cold biting deeper than the wind. "Project Deep Scan," Finn stated, the name dropping into the night air like a depth charge. Late 60s, early 70s. Navy, DARPA, whispers of other groups. Alphabet soup. The Cold War wasn't just fought in the sky or on land. It was fought under the waves. We were listening for Ivan's subs, sure, but we were also listening down, into the deep trenches, the Hadal zones, places no bathyscaphe could reach, places we weren't supposed to be poking. He turned his piercing gaze back to Vance, the moonlight catching the cold intensity in his eyes. "And we heard things, detective. Sounds. Not subs. Not geology. Complex. Organized. Intelligent. Coming from depths that should have been silent tombs. We call them the chorus." Vance felt the frigid ocean air solidify in her lungs. Arthur's journal entry screamed in her memory. Asterisk whispers. Not words. Sounds. Deep sounds. Like whale song, but wrong. Asterisk. Deep Scan was about mapping them. Finn continued, his voice low, almost lost in the crash of a larger wave. Understanding the source. Maybe attempting communication. We developed new sensors, passive arrays, dropped them down into the crushing dark. Just listening. For years. Then, late 74, we got a response. Not to our pings. To us. To the sensors themselves. Faint, fragmented, but undeniable. Acknowledgement. Then curiosity. He shivered, a movement that had nothing to do with the cold night. By mid-75, things changed. The signals grew stronger, more focused. Sometimes they seemed to be probing us, locating our sensors, triangulating our surface support ships. We started picking up anomalous energy signatures deep below, massive light sources, cold and bright like your artifact description, but vast. City-sized, some of them. And then we detected movement. Enormous signatures. Rising. Not drifting. Rising from the trenches. Moving towards the continental shelf. Towards shallower waters. Towards places like Haven's End. Arthur saw them. Vance breathed. The pieces clicking with dreadful certainty. Bellwether was unlucky, Finn said, his voice grim. Or incredibly observant. He knew that patch of ocean like his own heartbeat. He knew its normal sounds, its normal lights. When deep scan sensors detected unusual bioacoustic and EM activity converging precisely off Havens in that October, it triggered a level Sigma protocol. We had a vessel there, small, fast, unmarked experimental tech. The Kestrel. They reported the light. Not just hovering, pulsing. They reported the sudden formation of localized storm cells around it. Violent, chaotic, forming with impossible speed, like an energy field ripping the atmosphere apart. And they reported the retrieval. Vance's blood turned to ice water. Retrieval. Finn's face in the moonlight was a mask of haunted memory. A smaller light, detached from the main source, descended towards the cliffs, towards Bellwether's cottage. The storm wasn't natural, detective. It was a shield, generated by whatever was out there or by the interaction of its technology with our atmosphere. The Kestrel's instruments went berserk. Comms died. Visual confirmation was near impossible through the energy discharge and the torrential rain. But they saw the smaller light envelop the cliff top where Bellwether's cottage stood. Saw it hold position for moments. Saw it retract. And then the main light source descended vertically into the ocean, plunging deep. And as it went, it took the storm's fury with it. The sea, it didn't just calm down. It went flat, glassy, unnaturally still, within minutes, like turning off a switch. They took him, Vance whispered, the horror absolute, complete. The things beneath, the things he felt watching, they came up and took him. Finn nodded slowly, the movement heavy. Deep scan was terminated within hours. Classified beyond anything you've ever heard of. Cosmic top secret. All data physically seized and destroyed. Servers wiped, paper burned. All personnel reassigned to remote posts or retired under non-disclosure agreements that promise prison if broken. The official story was concocted, accidental drowning during a storm. But the local Coast Guard station had reported the sudden, unnatural calm after the event. That couldn't stand. It was a loose thread. So, the logs were altered. The weather report fabricated to erase the impossible storm, to make Bellwether's disappearance seem mundane, tragic, forgettable. To bury the truth that something from the crushing, lightless abyss had surfaced and taken a man. He gestured towards the dark, heaving ocean. Your artifact? Likely a piece of that smaller retrieval craft, shed during its descent or ascent through that chaotic energy field, missed by the Kestrel's frantic, blinded sensors in the artificial maelstrom, washed ashore years later. The final pieces slammed together with the force of tidal wave. The lights, the sounds, the impossible storm, the fabricated calm, Arthur's escalating terror. Finn's testimony exposed it. The cover-up wasn't just for a secret project. It was a cover-up for contact, for an encounter with intelligences so alien, so far beyond comprehension, that the only response was denial, erasure, and a desperate hope they would simply go away. Why tell me? Vance asked, her voice raw, stripped bare by the enormity of it. After all these years? After all the secrecy? Because of the artifact, Finn said, his eyes locking onto hers, filled with a dread that mirrored her own. Because it's not just sitting there. It's responding. Not broadcasting, not yet, but resonating, picking up deep ocean signals we can barely detect. Signals that have been increasing in frequency and complexity since you found it. The chorus, they know we have it. Your grandfather feared this. Feared what they took Bellwether for. Fear they might come back. Not for him. He's likely long gone. For what they left behind. Or for more. He looked directly at Vance, the weight of decades of silence and fear pressing down. The line 75 was to prevent panic, to buy time we didn't know how to use. Now, the truth might be the only thing that prevents something worse. Someone has to know. Someone has to be watching the watchers. Someone has to be ready when the ocean decides to reach up again. Finn turned without another word and melted back into the shadows of the dunes as silently as a ghost, leaving Vance utterly alone on the desolate beach. The vast, dark ocean stretched before her, an infinite, unknowable void. The rhythmic crash of the waves sounded different now. No longer just water on rock, but a heartbeat. A vast, alien heartbeat. Arthur Bellwether hadn't vanished into the sea. He'd been taken from it, plucked from the storm by intelligences from a realm of crushing pressure and eternal night. The government's lie, meticulously maintained for 2 decades, was shattered by a scrap of impossible metal and the conscience of an old spy. It revealed a terrifying reality. We are not alone, and the deepest, darkest waters hold minds ancient and powerful. Minds that watch. Minds that can reach up. The artifact in its mountain vault wasn't just evidence of a past event. It was a beacon. And Arthur Bellwether, the quiet fisherman who simply watched the sea, had become the first, unknowing ambassador to a hidden world beneath the waves, a world that was now chillingly aware of ours. The nation wasn't just stunned. It stood on the precipice of a profound and terrifying new understanding, gazing out at the restless, whispering ocean, forever wondering what watched back from the abyss and when the deep might decide to call again. The silence of the artifact was the loudest sound of all.